Okay, in this tutorial we're going to cover the Magic Wand tool. And surprise, surprise, it looks like a magic wand just like someone like Harry Potter would have. It's this little icon over here underneath the magnetic lasso tool. And it looks like a little wand with a little spark at the end of it, right underneath your quick selection tool as well. So, if you see this tool, the quick selection tool, you can just scroll down to the magic wand tool. Alright, so let's see what this thing does. Up here on the top left hand corner, you're always going to have your tool presets, and with any kind of selection option you're going to be given these four options up here. So a new selection, an added selection, a subtracted selection, and an intersect selection. And if you've already watched the Marquee Tools tutorials, then you would already be very familiar with the four of these. So just really quickly, a new selection will give you one new selection, and every time you select in a new area, the old one goes away. If you have an added selection, what do you know, it adds to the total selection. You can see the ants marching going here. Subtract from a selection would be if I wanted to get rid of this area or maybe this area, and now I've subtracted all of them. And a intersect selection would be if I started with a new selection and I wanted to do a intersect. So you see that it cut out this area and this area, leaving this middle part unselected, meaning that it intersected both of them and left what was intersected together. So those are the four basics. So we're going to leave it on new selection just to get an idea. Click off here. And what we're going to do is show you what a point sample versus a 100 by 101 does. So you saw me clicking around and you saw what 101 by 101 average does. What that means is it selects a 101 by 101 square selection of pixels. So basically a really wide area, and then it tries to grab everything based on your tolerance. So if I have a 101 by 101 average, so in other words a really big space with a really wide tolerance, I selected, look at that, all the stuff it's selected, not very specific at all. But if I were to crank this down and go to maybe 20 in my tolerance and make this a point sample, and I were to reselect this, right? Look at that, it's much more defined based on the color range that I selected. So the key is these work in combination with each other by saying point sample in a low tolerance or high average in a high tolerance. And if you want to find your in-betweeners, well then you could go a high average with a really low tolerance, or a low sample and a really high tolerance, or pick one of these and play with your tolerance a little bit. This anti-aliasing button here, you're going to get really familiar with if you haven't already seen it in the tool. And what that means is when this is selected, it's not going to give you jagged edges. And what I mean by that is, you see all these little spots here? They will be faded when I come off of this selection. So it's not going to give me that jagged, harsh look like if I were to draw an outline with a pencil and I would get pixel by pixel. No, it'll try to fade them in and feather the edges. That's what the anti-aliasing does, but very, very light. The contiguous checkbox basically means, okay, we're going to select the pixels that are closest to each other when they're right up against each other. But if it says, hey, this gradient is this color, but then this one starts to get a little bit too light, I'm not going to select it. That's what this contiguous means. And as for all sample layers, usually when you're in Photoshop, I only have one layer. You can see here is my background, but you're going to have multiple layers when you're editing an image, and sometimes you do want to take a selection from all the layers. If you do not have this selected, it will only choose from the layer you're on, and often in a layer you may only have maybe this model's eyeball selected that you're working on in one layer, and you're over here trying to mess with the gradient of the background. Well, if this isn't selected, then there's just no way that you're going to be able to do that. So I like to keep this on unless I'm working on very fine detail. Now here's what's awesome. So I've used my Magic Wand tool to select this, which is basically an auto selection tool based on a color scheme that you're picking. So if I wanted to come over here and select just her lips, so it's on a very low tolerance, so I'm going to jack this up a little bit to maybe 50 and reselect. There we go, there's a bigger chunk of her lip, and maybe just a little more, so let's try 75 over here. There we go, I'm getting some more of her lips. And now I want to show you what this refine edge does, and you will have seen this in some other selection tools already, but I'll just show you again really quick. See how it cuts everything out? This is kind of your mask mode up here, and you can choose whether or not you want an overlay so it will shadow it the way you want it, or you could do something like just on white, or maybe on black if that's more your preference, and it'll mask the opposite alpha channels. And we could always do on layers. I typically like to work in this mode, so I'm going to leave it there. And just let's look at the smart radius and crank this up. You see how it does a smart radius of what you really wanted to select. Not always the best, but sometimes it is useful. I like this though, the adjust edge to smooth it out. There you go, it's not quite as jagged. Especially when you're using the Magic Wand tool and it's so automatic, you're going to want to come in and play with this. Maybe just a tad of feather. If we get too much, you'll see that it really blows it out. And this contrast works in opposition with the feather, so if I really crank that up, you can see how defined it makes it again. And of course the shift edge, what that's going to do is it's either going to make your edge that you originally selected further out or further in. And you'll see what I'm talking about. So this would be further in by going subtract, or further out. And you could even give yourself a little bit more of the selection than you intended. So that's pretty much these refine edge tools. Don't worry about the decontaminate colors option. It's very rare that you're going to have an issue with that. That's just for when it brings it back to your selection and it's going to do a new layer and a new mask or a new document. It just depends on what you want. So if we go OK, right, then it's sent me back into this mode, and I can go back to layers and I can turn my layer back on, and of course I can come up here, and now that I have this separated in a new layer with the decontamination of my colors, now I can mess with this as much as I like. So if I wanted to, I could just come over here and erase this if I didn't want it, or I could paint on it. You see, so that's what this new mask and decontamination of colors does. It doesn't let you affect the rest of your image. So that's pretty much it for the Magic Wand tool, and it's really powerful if you use it correctly. So I would take some time and practice with this, practice selecting different things in a photograph and start getting used to its sensitivity, especially with your sample size and your tolerance. And remember, always keep anti-aliasing on and pay attention to your selection modes over here. That's pretty much it for the Magic Wand tool.